You are listening to Radio Free Humanity, the Marxist-Humanist podcast. My name is Brendan Cooney.
And I'm Andrew Kliman.
This episode is part 2 of an episode that was originally titled A Long Journey from Marxists to Marx. The first part of this podcast aired as episode 5 of Radio Free Humanity back in November, and we meant to air part 2 sooner, but the press of current events demanded that we release podcasts about the uprising in Lebanon and the UK elections in December, meaning that part 2 of this interview had to wait until the new year for its release. In the first part of this podcast, Andrew Kliman interviewed me, Brendan Cooney, about my political evolution from my early days as a YouTube Marxist to the present, and then we got on to the topic of my slow disillusionment with the work of David Harvey. In this episode, we continue the discussion about David Harvey, getting into a meatier critique of his notion of crisis theory. To hear more episodes of Radio Free Humanity, read more about the issues discussed, or to join in the conversation, please visit Marxist-Humanistinitiative.org. Please also consider making a donation on the website. While our podcast is hosted by Marxist-Humanist Initiative, the views expressed by the co-hosts and guests of Radio Free Humanity are their own. They do not necessarily reflect the views and positions of Marxist-Humanist Initiative. In just a moment, you will be listening to Andrew interview me, but first, we're going to take a few minutes to talk about some current events. When we last left this interview, Andrew and I were discussing David Harvey's theory of crisis, and that is where we pick up here.
But let me ask you about the other side of that, the theoretical content. So David Harvey is kind of eclectic because he's trying to produce, I guess, a theory of everything. But you said that there was a certain strong similarity between his understanding of economic crisis and that of the Monthly Review School. Would you say that that's an important element of his thinking?
Yeah, that's something it's still a bit of a mystery to me, actually. If you read Limits to Capital, Harvey's first book, he talks about Barron and Sweezy, the sort of founders of the Monthly Review School, a lot. They seem to be pretty influential in the way he's reinterpreting Marx's categories. And then he comes up with this theory of overaccumulation, which is like his theory of crisis, which most of his writing is then based around, like I had said before. And it's very similar in style and the words it uses to the Monthly Review School, but it's David Harvey's own unique spin on it. So it's not exactly the same, but it operates in a lot of the same ways. Basically, it's claiming that the real problem for capitalism isn't that there is a tendential fall in the rate of profit, but is that there's a basic capital surplus absorption problem, that capital creates profits and then has to figure out what to do with all this money. And so the problem is that there's too much capital, and capital is always trying to find new places to invest it. And that so for the Monthly Review School, this problem happens. Usually, the Monthly Review School is under consumptionist, right, in its take. So it's saying that the barriers to this capital being absorbed is that the working class doesn't have enough money because their wages are not high enough. For David Harvey, it's multi-causal. That yes, wages might be low, but also there might be problems with the flow of capital through space and time because of temporal space-time disturbances. And so anything can be a cause of crisis because it might block the flow of capital through space and time. So he's almost like he's taking the Monthly Review approach and just making it turning into like a multi-causal theory of everything.
Right. Although the Barron-Sweezy formulation is actually a theory of everything as well. They kind of put their stamp on that 1965 or 64 when the book Monopoly Capital came out, because they run into what would seem to most of us to be a really embarrassing place in their theory, where they're predicting capitalism being in continual crisis, such that, we should have expected it to collapse, before any of us were born, and I'm a lot older than you. So the theoretical problem that they then face is, how do you explain that the damn thing still exists? And here they come to one, the other, the third, the fourth, the 17th, kind of ad hoc seat of the pants. I can't remember what they call it, but, factor by which the capitalists are able to, delay the moment of final crisis and collapse. So kind of everything that actually happens in the world can be slotted into, okay, this is a thing that is delaying, preventing, holding back the eventual fall of capitalism due to this alleged over-accumulation problem. So that kind of explanatory framework, is very prominent there in Monopoly Capital, and in the latter chapters of the book, they're doing a lot of that. They're talking about the urban crisis in the United States, racial problems. They're talking about militarism. They're talking about advertising.
Yeah, that's definitely the same flavor as Harvey's approach. And then as well, Harvey is very taken up with the regulation school approach to theorizing capitalist history and capitalist societies. In the second book, The Conditions of Postmodernity, that's sort of the dominant theme of the book, that different periods of capitalist society solve this overaccumulation problem through a certain mode of regulation that describes all of the productive and consumption habits and political and philosophical ideas. So it really becomes a theory of everything on steroids. But I think that seems to me, I think, different than the monthly review school. I don't think of them as being necessarily regulation theory.
Yeah, as far as I know, just chronologically, Baran and Sweezy precede that.
They predate that. But I'm thinking the contemporary Bellamy Foster.
Yeah, I'm trying to think, about like what John Bellamy Foster says. I don't really know the relationship between the two, but I should say, for all of my disagreements with it, the regulation or regulation school is doing something more than just trying to label. What they're what the claim is that the accumulation of capital needs a whole set of conditions, and that's the mode, or what certain people in the United States call the social structure of accumulation. It's basically the same thing. And these conditions, for a time, work together to create a stable environment in which investment can take place, accumulation can proceed. So you need a whole set of institutional structures for capitalism, to function smoothly. But then any mode of regulation encounters contradictions, it begins to break down, and at that point, the system would just collapse or come to a standstill without a new mode of regulation. So there's a search and an attempt to reconstruct basically the totality of the political economy in new terms. And so you get these points about Fordism, post-Fordism, and so forth. So it's actually extremely ambitious, but it again is a theory of everything, just by virtue of this claim that kind of everything needs to fit together for the conditions to exist to permit a healthy level of capital investment. In any case, Harvey has got basically this view of overaccumulation. What I want to know from you is how you understand the exact relationship between what he's saying and what, like, Baran and Sweezy have said, and your problems with Harvey's version. Let me first of all say that when Marx talks about overaccumulation, I think it's invariably. I would be willing to come out on a podcast and say it is invariably, because I cannot remember any exceptions to this. The overaccumulation is a particular phase of basically a cyclical phenomenon, the business cycle, the boom and bust of the capitalist economy. And the overaccumulation refers to the phase of crisis right before the downturn in the economy. So it's not a chronic condition that plagues capitalism, every day. It's just another way of talking about suddenly there's a lack of demand. Demand for consumer goods and services, demand for investment goods, machinery, and so forth. So guess what? The stuff piles up on the shelves and in the warehouses. It's been over accumulated. So it's a way just of describing in somewhat different terms excess supply, which is the flip side of inadequate demand, which is not chronic in Marx's view, but it occurs at particular moments or one particular moment of a recurrent cycle.
Yeah.
You would agree with that? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so what does the term overaccumulation become in Harvey's hands?
Well, for Harvey, there is a chronic problem for capital of overaccumulation in the sense that capitalists make profits and then they have to find where to reinvest those profits. And because there are all these different moments in the circuit of capital where the capital could not return back to its investors due to all sorts of things, whether they're problems in circulation or production, that this is a chronic problem of having too much profits and the sort of dynamism of a capitalist society, its growth is a product of this crisis of overaccumulation. That's like a chronic state. I think that's the best I can rattle off an explanation off the top of my head.
Okay, and what makes it chronic?
Because there's always profit to be reinvested.
And why is it always the case that there are difficulties with the profitable reinvestment of profit?
That's where I think the whole thing falls apart.
Oh, good. We got to it quickly.
Yeah. And it's funny because I feel like, I have a vague memory of the first time reading David Harvey's book, The Condition of Postmodernity, and that was the one thing I didn't quite get about the book. But I think I brushed my concerns aside because it seemed to be explaining so much, the book. Set that aside, I didn't quite understand why it would be a problem to have too much capital. I mean, it only really makes sense if you can't find a profitable place to invest the money.
Correct. So
there has to be some theory of profit.
So what supposedly makes it a chronic condition that you can't find a sufficiently profitable outlet to reinvest your profit? You're telling me Harvey does not say?
No, I don't think he actually says why it's chronic.
Okay.
I think he just says because there are all these different places where problems can occur.
Okay. Sure. But there are hedging strategies, and there are risk premiums for more risky investment, and there are all kinds of analysts who are paid to assess the risks, and we know they do engage in lots of investment, and we also know that the investment the capitalists engage in it sometimes is rather strong, at other times it's weaker. Does he have any explanation of that pattern and those differences? Why is investment spending strong at some points?
To the best of my memory, and I don't know if he really addresses that kind of question directly, but I think the general line of explanation is like sort of historically contingent based upon various factors in the circuit of capital at different historical periods.
Harvey seems to give us no explanation for the alleged chronic problem of overaccumulation. Might he be just taking for granted that the way that Baran and Sweezy tried to explain it succeeded, that they were right?
Yeah, it very well might be. Yeah.
Do you recall him saying something like that or whatever?
I don't want to go on record, speaking for Harvey on that particular question, because I would have to go back and reread his statements about that more clearly. I think it's just maybe just safe enough to say that there's a lot of similarity in the way he uses the term overaccumulation to explain the dynamics of capitalism. So he's at least borrowing a lot from them, even if there might be some differences.
I mean, it's actually kind of difficult for me to assess this because in the space of just a couple of years, he said pretty contradictory things.
Yeah, I mean, if we're getting into his contemporary statements about this stuff, I think it's harder to read because he seems to say, even within one book, he'll say things that seem to be self-contradicting. So it's hard to
right.
It's hard to make sense of his more recent statements on these things.
Right. So what, when I was writing that response to him, I came across a lecture he had given, a paper, probably it was both, from only couple of years before, where he actually did a fairly good job, I thought, of explaining what Marx was saying in this very famous and much misunderstood and misrepresented passage where Marx says the ultimate cause of all real crises is the limited consumption of the masses. And underconsumptionist after underconsumptionist has trotted out this sentence, taking it totally out of context, to say that Marx had an underconsumptionist theory of crisis. And Harvey, did I thought a pretty careful reading and explication of the real sense of the passage in which that sentence comes. But then when he is critiquing the allegedly monocausal theory of crisis that flows from Marx's law of the tendential fall in the rate of profit, he invokes what I see, it was straight Baron and Sweezy. It was straight monopoly capital under consumption theory. And he kind of attributed that to Marx as well. So he may have even quoted that sentence. I don't know. So it's very hard. But okay, so we don't know why David Harvey thinks that there is this chronic overaccumulation of capital. He might just be relying on what Baron and Sweezy say. What do you think are the problems of David Harvey's notion and orienting concept of overregulation?
Well, I think this fascination with the circuit of capital and all the disturbances in the circuit of capital, that might be nice for sort of labeling all these temporal and spatial parts of our reality, but it doesn't really explain why you would have chronic blockages in the circuit of capital that would lead to a crisis, because capitalism has this thing called profit that works pretty effectively a lot of the time to coordinate investment so that capital can deal with the sort of small scale disturbances in circulation that inevitably happen in a society. It can move production into different places. It can source material from different places. It's just by following the profit. So it's not clear to me why just saying that capitalism has to grow exponentially is enough to explain why it must go into crisis. As long as they can find profitable places to invest, it's not clear to me why there would be a chronic problem of crisis. It seems like you really need a theory of crisis that relates specifically to the rate of profit. And Marx has that. He has a theory which explains what forces would cause the rate of profit in society to fall over a long period of time. And such a theory could then explain why you could get all sorts of blockages and appearances of overaccumulation in the circuit of capital at certain periods, not as a chronic condition, but as a periodic part of a cycle of boom and bust.
Okay, so but basically you're saying Harvey just does not answer the one question that begs for an answer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. He tries to talk about it in his first book, Limits to Capital. He really tries to deal with it. But I think basically, I think what he's up against at Limits to Capital is that Marxists of his time thought that Marx's theory of the tendential fall in the rate of profit was internally inconsistent, or it was, theoretically flawed, and so they couldn't use it to explain a theory of crisis. And so they had to create these workarounds. And so he has all sorts of very vague workarounds he's trying to do. That it's Marx really his falling rate of profit was just sort of a surface appearance of a deeper underlying contradiction between the forces and relations of production. And I'm going to create the sort of fixed version of Marx, so we don't have to rely on the rate of profit as a explanatory device. But the result is you get a theory that doesn't really hold together that clearly when you put it under a microscope.
Right. I think other people have tried in other ways and in some sense been more successful. But certainly, you mentioned way back at the start of this episode, the alleged transformation problem, and now the alleged, proof of falsity in Marx's law of the tendential fall in the rate of profit. I spent many years, actually decades, disproving that, rediscovering other disproofs, trying to get some recognition and discussion around this. It's been very hard.
Well, I should say, in response to one of your earlier questions about what sort of made me start to rethink some of these secondary source material that I've been reading and their influence in my thought. I mean, your book on the transformation problem and the rate of profit, your book, Reclaiming Marxist Capital, was probably one of the most influential things I read during that time period in my life, because I read that and I said, oh, well, I can actually go to Marx and read this for what it is now, instead of thinking it has to be fixed by someone else. So it kind of gave me it was like now I had permission to read Marx and evaluate things in my own terms, or evaluate things on their own terms with my own head, my own thinking mind, rather than thinking I needed to only read Marx through interpreters who had fixed the errors in Marx.
I'm really glad to hear that, because that was indeed the purpose of the book.
Yeah,
you know, I mean, you said it very well. Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't think I had like permission to do that until I read your book, and then I said, "Oh, wait a minute. Well, let me go back and read this on its own terms, and then I'm going to go back and read what Harvey wrote about this again. Now that I've read what Marx wrote about it, and now I don't think Harvey actually makes that much sense anymore, because he was, just kind of making all these very evasive and vague arguments to get around the fact that he didn't think, or that he was being told probably, from what he had read, that the theory of the rate of profit was internally inconsistent. When you read The Limit of Capital, kind of understanding the debates around the Occhio theorem, you kind of can see it pretty clearly for what's going on. That he bumps up against this Occhio theorem that says that the Marxist theory of crisis is kind of problematic, and then Harvey doesn't quite understand it because he's not like a math guy, and so he's trying to like dance around it and come up with his own solutions that don't require him to without having to really engage with like the actual sort of theoretical problem itself.
Right. Okay, this raises to my mind a very big question. Harvey really does not understand, from what you're saying, the arguments. He doesn't have the conceptual basis for judging one way or another whether the Occhio theorem is a legitimate theorem.
Yeah, I think so. That's the impression I've gotten from reading Limits to Capital, is that he's aware that it exists.
Right.
He's read plenty of the secondary literature, knows that it's considered to be this mortal blow against Marxist theory of crisis, doesn't really have a way for himself to like evaluate and engage with it, and so he sort of wants to dance around it.
Right. But he doesn't dance to the extent that he takes a position that this Occhio theorem is a real, honest to goodness theorem, and that Marx, got it wrong, and that Marx has to be fixed.
Right. Yeah.
And he doesn't know that to be the case himself.
Yeah, that could be.
Could it be different?
I mean, I can't speak. I don't know what he knows. I don't.
Right.
I'm not.
I see.
I'm not in his brain. I don't know.
Right.
I can only guess from the way he summarizes arguments and responds to them. I don't know what he...
Right, but you seem to be saying that in the text there is an account of what Marx did that is wrong and needs to be fixed, and that account does not withstand scrutiny.
Yeah.
Okay. Which go to me. Look, I don't know David Harvey's work half as well, as you do. Maybe not even a quarter as well. But I've seen this kind of thing again and again, with respect to this issue, with respect to the alleged transformation problem, and so forth and so on. And to me, this raises the question of why, because whether it's true, it seems to be, but whether it is actually honest to goodness true in David Harvey's case, it's true in a lot of cases. People are taking anti-Marx positions without really understanding what they would need to understand to come to some real judgment based on what the arguments are, who's right, who's wrong. So they come to a position when they don't really have the intellectual resources to come to a position. So the question is, why? What is driving them to come to a position? Why is that position that they come to, like, invariably, that Marx got it wrong and Marx needs to be fixed? So those are the questions that come to my mind.
I don't know if I have any brilliant answers to that.
Yeah.
But I can very much understand the sort of insurmountable hurdle that is posed to some people who want to work on Marx's economics, but then run into the Srathian critique. By which I mean the transformation problem and the Okishio theorem both come from this Srathian perspective on Marx's value theory. And, someone like me, I'm not a trained economist, I'm not a mathematician. I can very slowly and painstakingly make my way through, say, Ian Steedman's book, Marx After Sraffa, but I'm totally at a loss for, say, actually working through Borkowitz's original work on the transformation problem or working through Okishio theorem. I don't have the chops to really understand that material, so I am somewhat at the mercy of interpreters for understanding that material. And I think a lot of people, even people like David Harvey, maybe who are, I would assume is trained not in those mathematical and, economic traditions, also might bump into this problem that they have to rely on the interpreters because the source material is pretty impenetrable. And Andrew, that's why your book, Reclaiming Marxist Capital, was so important and is so important, because not only is it very accessible compared to other literature on the topic, but it makes it very clear that the issues here are not just about the numbers, but about the assumptions behind these equations and matters of textual interpretation. And that allows people to make their own judgments about whether they think the Sraffian critique is relevant to Marx's theory or not, without having to surrender to the experts and surrender to the theoretical authorities.
Yeah, I mean, Marx makes a certain argument. These people put it in a certain within a certain mathematical formalism, specifically the prices of inputs into production per unit of input has to equal the prices of outputs of the same kind of item produced at the end of that period. The input prices have to equal the output prices per unit. They impose that assumption. Did Marx impose that assumption? If you impose that assumption, like they do, Marx's conclusions don't hold. You don't impose that, Marx's conclusions are not affected. So the point is that an error in Marx or is that an error in interpretation? That's pretty much the short version. But they all come to the conclusion it's Marx's error. So I'm wondering, what pressures are there, subjective, objective, communal, within the community of academics? What pressures are there to again and again and again come down on the side of Marx is wrong and we got to fix it, and here, listen to my fix. My fix is the best fix. Why is that happening? People who are saying this are in many cases, probably, I won't say all the cases, but it's very, very common. These are people who actually cannot evaluate the arguments for the reasons that you've said. They don't understand the matrix algebra, and you go to some of these original sources like Vladislav von Borkiewicz, it's almost incomprehensible what he's writing anyway. So, it's a tough job. And if that's not your thing, cool, it's not your thing. But then if you don't know enough to have a position, why take a position despite that?
Yeah.
I mean, I think I know the answer, but it's taken me decades to figure out what the answer is.
Which is that within academia, there's a pressure to differentiate your own thinking as a unique product to sell yourself as an academic. Yeah,
but it's actually double-sided because, look, it's very easy to differentiate yourself from Marx. I mean, everybody does it, right? Everybody lodges a critique of Marx. The difference with these people is that they want to have their cake and eat it too.
Right. They want to be in the Marx tradition, have some sort of radical bona fides, but also have to say something different.
Yeah, they want to say something different from Marx, but have it be in the Marx tradition and to make themselves as if they are the inheritors, the legitimate inheritors of the project, the tradition of Marx. And the only way to do that is to say, Marx made an error, but it's one that can be fixed. And so here is my fix.
Right, right.
So that's what I think is going on. Let's go back to this issue where you said, when you originally read David Harvey, you thought it was brilliant, it's great bathroom reading, and you got something out of it. It was something satisfying that you were able to look at all of these events and issues and things going on and situate them within the framework of the circulation of capital, or the circuit of capital. And you say there's a lot of other people who are like this. They don't read for the purpose of understanding whether what they're reading is internally coherent. They read for other things. So, what's wrong with that? Why are you spoiling their fun? Why is your critique important?
Well, it could just be that I'm being mean, but I suspect there's a little more to it than that. If we really want to be serious about anti-capitalist thinking and anti-capitalist movements and creating some alternative to capitalism, then we have to be accountable for our ideas and develop them to their logical extent and engage in debate and abandon ways of thinking and modes of thinking that don't arrive at conclusions that are defensible. Sometimes I think inside the bubble of certain left academic bubbles, people aren't necessarily held to that much accountability, and because maybe their ideas don't have an effect on the world, they're not attached to movements that are out there changing the world, and so they can exist in sort of a bubble and not be held to accountability. But when the Great Recession hit and David Harvey got a lot more attention, he, for instance, had this debate, I think, for a while with Brad DeLong, who's a straight ahead economist, and Harvey didn't do that well. I think he wasn't prepared for being outside of his comfort zone, and he didn't really have the chops to defend his notions that clearly, I think. And like I said earlier, I think earlier in my life, I was able to tolerate a much greater level of generality in anti-capitalist thinking, and I thought that all that was really important was to advance sort of a general anti-capitalist sentiment, and that I didn't quite see the importance of taking positions on every nuance and detail of some of these theoretical debates. But I now realize that these theoretical differences really lead to big differences in how we understand the world and how we envision an alternative to capitalism, or even what we envision capitalism is. For instance, if we were to take David Harvey's claim that neoliberalism is a political project, that is, that the neoliberal era was a result of this political project by neoliberal thinkers to sort of reclaim the social surplus for themselves, then that leads us to sort of a social democratic sort of politics, where we think that putting different peoples into the heads of capitalist states with different ideas is going to create more equitable and less parasitic societies. But if we take a different view of neoliberalism, that the neoliberal politics of that era were the result of long-term economic trends that are outside of the control of human action, that leads us to see a real limitation to that sort of social democratic project. So what may seem like a pretty abstract academic argument about textual interpretation of Marx, or about why crises happen in capitalist society, have a real bearing on our immediate conceptualization of what it means to be anti-capitalist and what anti-capitalist movements should fight for. And I think that if we're going to really have successful anti-capitalist movements, we need to be challenging ourselves and challenging other people who claim to be working in this tradition to be, theoretically responsible about the things they write and say, and to engage critically with each other so we can sort of advance a common understanding about these issues.
Yeah, let me ask you about that. So you said if we don't have a shared understanding of what capitalism is, we can't agree to get rid of it,
Yeah,
something like that.
yeah,
I mean, I don't think that that's actually the case. I think different people can, and I think what this is what exists right now. In fact, it's a description of the actual situation. People have different understandings of the societies in which we live, which are capitalist. They have different understandings, partial understandings of what they might want instead, and they don't tend to discuss that future, possible non-capitalist future society, but they all do agree we got to change what is. And you can do that even if you don't have a shared understanding beyond some very superficial level of what it is that is. You just say, whatever it is, we don't like it, and we can get together, to change it. I think that most left politics works on that basis. Would you agree, disagree?
yeah. I do think that a lot of left politics operates on that basis, but I don't see how that can lead to an actual movement that replaces capitalism with a better society. I would think that if we're going to actually do that, we have to have some kind of common understanding beyond basic generalities about what we're fighting for.
Well, I think so, but I think that most people don't think so because they stagify the process.
Hmm.
Okay, so instead of a single process of tearing down the old and creating the new, they think, well, the first thing is to get rid of this and that and the other, and then we can think about the future.
Yeah.
I think that's a huge error. I think it's plagued the left for a very, very long time. But I think that to move people away from that kind of thinking, what one has to do is, among other things, to interrogate the assumption that splitting of things into two stages where we can just worry about getting rid of what is without what's going to come after it. We have to interrogate that assumption. It's just by no means something to take for granted. The question of our age, and it's been the question of our age ever since the Russian Revolution turned into Stalinist counter-revolution. The question of our age is what happens after the revolution, and that needs to be thought through beforehand, and that needs to be, one needs to understand that the way in which one changes things is going to influence, if not determine, the outcome of what happens after. But we don't get this kind of discussion, really. And I think it's just because people want quick victories, So if the actual revolutionizing of all aspects of society, in a way that's conducive to human flourishing seems so big and difficult and far off a project, let's think about, getting rid of this government and putting in our people. That seems doable. And right now, we don't have to, argue about these abstruse points of theory and so forth. And I think the only way to really attack that is to say, you get rid of this stuff, and one of your papers or presentations or something, you quoted, who was it, the Police, Duran Duran?
What was the quote?
Meet the new boss, same as the old boss?
Oh, yeah. Is that's the Who.
The Who, okay,
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's what happens,
Yeah.
So, it's Animal Farm, right?
Hello, this is Anne Jacquard, Organizational Secretary of Marxist-Humanist Initiative. Marxist-Humanist Initiative, or MHI, aims to contribute to the transformation of this capitalist world by projecting, developing, and concretizing the philosophy of Karl Marx and its further development in the Marxist-Humanism articulated by Raya Dunayevskaya. We are not a political party, nor are we trying to lead the masses, whose emancipation must be their own act. But we have seen that spontaneous actions alone are insufficient to usher in a new society. We seek a new unity of philosophy and organization in which mass movements striving for freedom lay hold of Marxist philosophy of revolution and recreate society on its basis. Today's political, economic, and environmental crises present a moment to engage people in discussion of these ideas. MHI is dedicated to the task of proving theoretically that an alternative to capitalism is possible. We are distinguished by our economic analyses, which demonstrate that the only opposite to the current world economic system is its abolition and replacement with one not based on the production of, quote, value. Because capitalism cannot be fundamentally reformed, attempts to reform it lead to an intensification of state capitalism, not socialism. MHI's ideas and actions, as well as our structure and rules, are guided by the interests of working people and freedom movements, of people of color, LGBTQ people, other minorities, youth, and all those around the world who are struggling for self-determination in order to freely develop their own human natures. We have no interests separate and apart from theirs. We intend to practice, as well as espouse, a two-way road between our organization and people outside it as essential to developing a single dialectic in the relationship of theory to practice.
And that's the end of this episode of Radio Free Humanity, the Marxist-Humanist podcast. If you enjoy the podcast, please do subscribe, leave us a comment, and leave us a donation. You can do all those things at Marxist-Humanistinitiative.org. You can find the podcast on iTunes and Google Play and Apple Podcasts and Stitcher and all those other places as well.